everyone! Welcome back to Rima Reads. So today I'm going to be reviewing two of Robert Jackson Bennett's series, the Foundryside series and the Divine Cities series. And I'm going to do a quick review on both of these series and then talk about the diversity aspects in these series to determine whether or not Robert Jackson Bennett is going to be a white man that I trust. So in general, I don't read that many white male authors, which is kind of surprising considering fantasy is my favorite genre and fantasy is dominated by white men. But the books I read tend to be written by females or people of color because that's what I gravitate toward. There's really only one white male author I trust, and that's Brando Sando. All other white male authors are on thin ice. That's just how I live my life, y'all. And so we'll see if Robert Jackson Bennett gets to join the trust area or not. Yeah, so let's get into it. So I read Foundryside last year, and this book quickly became one of my favorite new series of the year. So there are two books in the series currently. There is Foundryside and Shorefall. And the third book is going to be coming out at some point in the future. I don't really know when, but at some point. And Foundryside takes place in this world where there's a magic called scribing, and it basically is kind of like instructions to trick an object into believing something is true. So you could scribe a wheel to believe that it's always going downhill and then it'll keep rolling. So then you can have rolling carts without having horses drag them and things like that. So it's a really, really cool magic system, and the scribing can get really, really complicated and intricate, and there's a lot of detail in that magic system about scribing. And our main character is Sansina, who is a thief who can hear scribings. They talk to her in her head, and she goes on this mission to steal this key, and that ends up causing this whole chain of reactions. And yeah, it's a really good story. It has a lot of what I love in a fantasy series. It has really, really cool plot and mystery, and we love the key cleft, love him, and there's found family in there. There's anti-capitalistic themes in there. The plot is super, super engaging. So I loved Foundryside, and Shorefall, the sequel, was just as good, if not better. It takes place 5 years after the events of Foundryside and follows Sansina based off of what happens in the first book. I did a whole rant gush review on that book because I loved it. I thought it was amazing, but I did not like the 5-year time gap. So I'll link that above if you're interested. But again, I thought that book was amazing. Foundryside and Shorefall quickly became one of my fave new series of 2020. And so, of course, I had to read Robert Jackson Bennett's earlier work, his earlier fantasy work, City of Stairs, which I had read 4 or 5 years ago and just forgot all about it. So I read City of Stairs in January with the Shelf Space Discord server, and then I continued on with the series and read City of Blades and City of Miracles and finished them both a week or two ago. So quick summary on those books. So the Divine Cities trilogy takes place in this world where there were once divinities that ruled the land, and so the country called the continent worshipped these divinities, and the divinities granted them so many miracles and magic and all this really, really cool stuff. And because of this, the continent ended up basically colonizing the rest of the world and enslaving them. So one of their countries that they colonized, Sapor, ends up rebelling and killing all the divinities. And so when that happens, it kind of desolates the continent. Lots of their buildings just collapse, their miracles are gone, their people are more into poverty and don't know how to deal with the fact that all their divinities are dead. And so this book takes place 80 years, or the first book takes place 80 years after the events of this rebellion that Sapor created. And our main character, Shara, is a Sapor spy. So she and her secretary, Sigrid, end up going to the city of Bulkov, the capital in the continent, to investigate the murder of Dr. Ephraim, who is a Sepor historian studying the divinities. In this world, post-divinity world, people from the continent aren't allowed to talk about the divinities. It's very highly censored, and only Seporians are allowed to like even investigate the divinities. And then someone killed Ephraim who was doing some research on them. So Shara goes and tries to solve this murder. I liked this series a lot. I did not think it was as good as Foundryside, but I think it was a very, very solid fantasy series. The first book struggled a little bit with being a bit slow in the beginning and then not connecting to the characters as much. But I think books 2 and 3 definitely do better in that aspect. Book 2 takes place 5 years after the events of City of Stairs, and it follows a different point of view. It follows General Mulagesh, who we meet in the first book as the mayor of Bulkov. She's a Saipurian general who has become mayor of the city, and we meet her again 5 years later. The book does a lot better job of you connecting to her as a character through her PTSD as being, you know, a general in a war and all of the events that happened in the first book. And again, in this book, she is sent to a city to investigate a missing persons. So again, it is definitely mystery like the first one, but it picks up much quicker and there are like more horror elements in it. I liked the second book better than the first one, and so that one was more of a 4.5 for me. And then the third book follows Sigrid, who is the secretary of Shara in the first book, but he's really like an enforcer, bodyguard sort of person to her. It takes place 13 years after the events of City of Blades, so there are like huge time jumps between all of these books. And by then you're kind of much more invested in him as a character because he's in the first 2 books as a very interesting side character, and so it's great to see him and his point of view and that whole journey. And I thought this series was wrapped up so well. I really, really enjoyed the ending of this series, which gives me a lot of hope for the Foundryside's trilogies and how that's going to be wrapped up. But I think it brought into circle a lot of the themes that they were talking about in these books, and so I was just very, very impressed. I'll say the Divine Cities was probably like a 4 to 4.5 star series for me. I'm thinking more along the 4 line because there are things that could be better, and I wasn't as in love with it like I was with Foundryside. But overall, like, Robert Jackson Bennett has written 2 really, really good fantasy series so far, which is hard. It's hard to impress me that much. So overall, just like plot, character, world building wise, I think both of these series are really good, and I very much enjoyed them both. I think they're very different styles. So Foundryside feels a bit younger because since, you know, when we start the book is like 18-ish, and it has like that found family trope, which I love. That's probably why I like it a bit more. Where the Divine Cities series has much older protagonists, all in their 30s or above, and there's bigger time gaps in between. But overall, both 2 very solid fantasy series. The plot is great on both of them, and the world building is, I think the world building is cooler in the Divine Cities series, but I love Foundryside's more. So overall, great books. So that's already put Robert Jackson Bennett, you know, writing great books on my radar. But the thing that impressed me about both of these books is they're very diverse, which I was not expecting. Like, it's just not something that before going into these series, I was like, oh yes, this is going to be a diverse read. Like sometimes when I'm reading a book, like if I'm reading a book by a POC author, like, or based off of like Indian mythology, of course I expect those books to be diverse. But not this one. Neither of these, actually, and so I was impressed. First, Robert Jackson Bennett does a great job writing his female characters. City of Stairs and City of Blades both have a woman as the main protagonist of those books, and they're both very, very different. Shara is like a historian turned spy, and she uses like really good at code breaking and then thinking of history and, you know, like political maneuvering and things like that. Whereas General Mulagesh in the second book is a general, a PTSD war veteran, and she is definitely more gruff person who's like struggling to fit the role that Shara has put her in. And so very different women in this series, but they're both written so well. And Sansia, who is my favorite, who is the main protagonist of the Foundryside series, is just such a great female character, and I love her so much. We see her grow a lot from being like this thief who's just like trying to make her way in the world and survive, to someone who like grows to fight for a cause for people that she loves. And I really like all of his female characters, and like I feel like it's a pretty low bar of like, yes, you write female characters well, but it's still a bar you have, like, I want people to reach. So Robert Jackson Bennett has definitely reached that bar. He can write female characters just as complexly as he writes his male characters. And he also writes his characters diversely in terms of race. So Sepur from the Divine Cities series is loosely based off of India, while I believe the continent is loosely based off of Russia. That might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that is what it is. And so already we have the protagonists of the first two books also being women of color, particularly like brown, Indian coded women, which is great. And like half of the people in those books are people of color. And Sansia, our main protagonist in Foundrysides, is a black woman. I don't know what the races of any of the other characters in that series, but I do know Sansia is a black woman. And so it's great that Robert Jackson Bennett is out here like putting these characters, like just not default making everyone white, but like putting different races and ethnicities to what his main characters. I definitely appreciate that Sansia from Foundrysides is a black woman, because I think a lot of her backstory has a lot more meaning because of it. And so yeah, he did really well on his diversity for races in these books. In addition, he's done decently well as his portrayal of disabilities. The main one I can think of is Mulagish from the second book of the Divine Cities series. Mulagish uses a prosthetic arm from an arm that she lost in battle, and he does a really good job of like explaining the struggles that she has with her prosthetic arm, and I thought that was done really well as well. And so I don't know, I was like pretty impressed with Robert Jackson Bennett, as you guys can see, because this is like not the level I expect from my white male fantasy authors. Like, it's nice to have, but I don't expect it. But maybe I should expect more. But the one area that I wanted to talk about in particular is his queer representation, because that was where the Divine Cities series lacked the most. I think his representation in the Divine Cities was pretty bad in terms of queer rep, but then he kind of does it really well in the Foundryside series. And so I wanted to go into particular details on why I think the representation is bad in the Divine Cities trilogy, but to do that I do have to go into spoilers. So I'm going to do like a quick spoiler section. Feel free to skip through it, and I'll put a little like banner or something here so you can just skip through it. But it is going to be major spoilers for book 1, and then very, very minor, like basically no spoilers for book 2, and then very minor spoilers for book 3. So the Divine Cities trilogy doesn't have that much LGBT rep in general, but the first book does have the character of Vohannes Voltres. So Vohannes, when he's first introduced, you get this like vaguely homophobic line from Shara about how the last thing she said to him ever was how he prefers men. And you're kind of like, that's sus, Shara, why are you saying these things? And then you get more and more of their backstory and their history. And essentially, Shara and Vohannes dated while they were in school together. Vohannes was from a rich family from the continent, and he was sent to Sepur to study. And him and Shara were both like super, super smart, so they started dating. And then he ends up like cheating on her with a guy. Then she figures it out and is like very, very mad at him, and then they break up, and she says this vaguely homophobic thing to him. Yeah, it's is not a good look. Just like that whole backstory is not great because, so Vohannes is a bi man. You see that he is and was in love with Shara that entire time, but he did cheat on her. But he is a bi man. He likes both women and men. And so the fact that we have the only LGBT character in this entire book be a bi man and also be a cheater is not a great look. There's already a stereotype that bi people cannot be monogamous, that they are serial cheaters, which is not true, and it's a very harmful stereotype. And having the only bi character in your book perpetuate that stereotype is bad. Just objectively, it's bad. And there's a lot of things that like Shara thinks about Vohannes that I don't particularly like. Vohannes comes from like a rich family in the continent, but he hates his family because they were like bad people. And he also like, you know, is trying to make the city a better place. But doing so, he might go through some shady methods. Shara doesn't know. She's like trying to figure out what his motivations are, whether he is someone she can trust right now or not. And in doing so, she talks, like when she's talking about Vohannes, there's like this particular line that I'm thinking of. She talks about how he is divided. And it's unclear when she's talking about how he is divided on whether he's dividing, you know, between his family loyalty and what's best for his people, or if he's divided between loyalty to the continent and Sapor, or if he's divided between liking guys and liking girls. It's not clear in the text, but just based off of the history and the backstory that we know about Vohannes, it vaguely sounds like the third one, which again is biphobic. Bi people are not divided, they just like both, and it's chill. And then finally, there is this whole plot line where Shara is wondering if Vohannes is behind the whole thing, and you kind of think he is. And then at the end, you learn that he is not behind the whole mystery, murder, everything bad that's going on. And then he is like promptly killed off. And y'all, we don't need no more bury your gays up in here. Like, it's particularly bad. I think Vohannes' entire arc in this story was bad. I'm not even particularly attached to this character, but to have your only queer character in your book series be killed off is just not a good look. And so I was very disappointed with Robert Jackson Bennett's queer rep in this series. In book 2, there's like no queer characters at all. And then in book 3, there is one queer couple. Guess what happens to them? Just guess. Yeah. So yeah, it was not done well. So, end of spoiler section. Essentially, the queer representation in the Divine City series is bad, in my opinion. Obviously, some of y'all can disagree with me, and that's valid. But in my opinion, it was just bad representation. But the thing is, Foundryside has good representation. And so, Foundryside is a series that was written later. Our main character, Cynthia, is a sapphic woman. She has an amazing relationship with another character, and it's done so well, particularly in the second book. Romance is not a focus of either of these series at all, so all of these things are very minor, like minor side plots. But I think Cynthia's romance is done really, really well. And so it's kind of interesting to see the difference between the Divine Cities and the Foundryside series in terms of queer rep. In the Divine City series, they do talk about how the continent was like more homophobic, but they also say like Sapor wasn't. And if that was the case, then why was the rep so bad? Because if Sapor wasn't homophobic, you could have other representation besides these like this one character. Thing is, I don't know if it was on purpose or not. If he realized that the queer representation that he did in the Divine Cities was bad, and so he decided to do better in Foundryside. And if that was the case, I would be like real happy, because that's what authors should do. Like, if you do something shitty in a novel, you apologize and vow to make it better in the future. And so if that was the case, I would be like super stoked, and Robert Jackson Bennett would be 100% white man I trust. because like the other white man I trust, Brandon Sanderson, definitely has a bad history with LGBT rep in his series, and he knows this, and the fans have talked to him about it, and now he's doing better, and there's proof of it in his latest novels, that he is doing better. And so if there's others like that, when they realize they've done bad rep and then are going to do better, I definitely trust them a lot more. I have no proof of it, so, you know, I don't know. I tried to Google for like 5 seconds and couldn't really find too much info on Robert Jackson Bennett in general. So Robert Jackson Bennett has written 2 pretty like good to amazing series. I mean, Foundryside, we still have to hold off judgment till the last book comes out, but I have real high expectations, especially after the ending of Shorefall, which was amazing. So he has written 2 good to amazing series. And in those series, there's a lot of diversity with great female characters, you know, people of color, some disability rep, not like a crazy amount, but it's there. And there's queer representation. In one case, I think it was done really badly. In the other case, I think it was done well. And so, is this a white man I should trust? Who knows? Not me. But I do think Robert Jackson Bennett has done enough that I really like his books, and I'm going to continue reading them, and continue, well, I haven't bought them yet, but I am going to buy his books, because I do like him as an author and I want to support them. Yeah, that was just a look at the diversity in both of Robert Jackson Bennett's books and whether I think they're good or not. Obviously, what I think is just like one person's opinion, and you know, I'm definitely not part of all of these groups that I have opinions on, and so my opinions don't matter as much as someone who is actually, you know, disabled or anything like that. And so you can always take everything I said with a grain of salt. It could just be wild ramblings of Rima, but I do think he did a good job in most aspects except for one, and he has shown growth in that one aspect, which gives me hope. And we will have to see how Foundryside's series concludes, but I think, y'all, this is another white man I trust. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Thank you all for watching. Bye.